At the beginning of this story, England is a small, poor, rain-soaked kingdom on the edge of Europe, with perhaps 3 million people in it, and no empire of any kind. It has no colonies. It has no permanent navy to speak of. Its principal export is undyed woolen cloth, sold to merchants in Antwerp who do the profitable part of the work somewhere else. Its treasury is empty, and has been for most of a century. Its army, when it needs one, is raised by asking noblemen to bring their tenants. Spain, by contrast, rules an empire that runs from California to the southern tip of Chile, and the silver mines of a mountain in Bolivia are producing so much bullion that the arrival of the treasure fleet each year moves prices across the whole of Europe. Portugal holds a chain of fortified ports from Mozambique to Macau and controls the spice trade with the East. Between them, these two kingdoms have already divided the unclaimed world in half. That division is not a figure of speech. In 1494, at Tordesillas, Spain and Portugal drew a line down the Atlantic and agreed that everything west of it belonged to one and everything east to the other, and the Pope confirmed it. The entire surface of the earth outside Europe had been allocated by treaty to two countries. England was not one of them. 330 years later, English is the language of government from Ottawa to Auckland, and roughly a quarter of the land surface of the planet is administered from a set of offices in London. The question this story is about is how that happened, and the answer is not the one the phrase conquered a quarter of the world implies. England never had the men to conquer a quarter of the world. At the height of the empire, it did not have the men. What it had was a way of paying for things, and it worked it out here at the beginning, when it was too poor to do anything else. Consider the position Elizabeth I inherited in 1558. She was 25. The crown was in debt at rates approaching 14%, borrowing from bankers in Antwerp because no English lender would take the risk. The coinage had been debased so badly by her father that it had to be recalled and reminted, an operation that consumed years and much of what money there was. There was a war with France to be ended, a religious settlement to be improvised, and a rebellion in Scotland to be quietly funded. She could not afford a navy. This is a plain fact about the reign that tends to get lost behind everything that came after. The great expansion of English sea power happens later under other monarchs, paid for by an institution that did not exist yet. What Elizabeth had was a few dozen ships in reasonable repair and no money to build more. What she also had, and what mattered far more, was a large number of men who wanted to go and rob the Spanish, and no legal way of letting them. The solution was old, and it had a technical name. A letter of marque was a document issued by a sovereign authorizing a private ship to attack the vessels of a named enemy. It converted piracy into a licensed activity. The ship, the crew, the guns, and the risk were all supplied by private investors. The Crown supplied the paper and took a share of whatever came back. This is the arrangement that everything else in this story grows out of. So it is worth being clear about what it actually is. It is a state with no money outsourcing violence to people who will fund it themselves, in exchange for a percentage. The state does not command. It invests. The most successful of these ventures was commanded by a Devon man in his mid-30s named Francis Drake. Drake had already made 2 voyages to the Caribbean, the second of which involved crossing the Isthmus of Panama, climbing a tree, and becoming, by his own account, the first Englishman to see the Pacific, at which point he is supposed to have prayed that God would grant him leave to sail an English ship upon it. In December of 1577, he left Plymouth with 5 ships and a set of instructions that were, deliberately, not written down in full. Elizabeth was an investor. So were several members of her Privy Council. The stated purpose was exploration. He went through the Straits of Magellan, which no Englishman had done, lost most of his ships to storms and desertion, and came out into the Pacific with one vessel, the Golden Hind, and about 80 men. And then he found something the Spanish had never had to think about, which was that their Pacific coast was entirely undefended. There had never been an enemy there. The ships carrying silver north from Peru to Panama did not travel in convoy and did not carry serious armament, because for 60 years there had been no reason to. He worked his way up the coast, taking them one after another. The largest, a treasure ship the sailors nicknamed Cacafuego, surrendered after a brief exchange and yielded something in the region of 80 pounds of gold, 13 chests of coin, and 26 tons of silver. It took 6 days to transfer the cargo. He then crossed the Pacific because returning the way he had come would have meant sailing past every Spanish port he had just robbed, traded for spices in the Moluccas, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and came home to Plymouth in September of 1580, having gone around the world. The accounting of that voyage is the single most important number in the early history of the British Empire. The exact figures are disputed, and the records were deliberately obscured at the time. But the generally cited return to the investors is somewhere around £47 for every pound put in. The Queen's share alone has been estimated as sufficient to clear the entire foreign debt of the English crown, with a substantial sum left over. She knighted him on the deck of his own ship in front of the Spanish ambassador, who had come to demand the return of stolen property. What that voyage established was not naval supremacy. Drake's expedition was a raid, and raids do not build empires. What it established was a proposition that could be put to men with money in London, that a share in an overseas venture was the highest returning investment available anywhere in Europe. That proposition is the engine. Everything in the next 300 years runs on it. Spain, understandably, took a different view of these events, and in 1588, Philip II sent a fleet of about 130 ships up the Channel, with the intention of escorting an invasion army across from the Netherlands. The Armada failed for reasons that had more to do with weather, poor coordination, and an unworkable plan than with English gunnery, though the English gunnery was good. Fireships broke the Spanish formation off Calais. A running fight at Gravelines did real damage, and then the wind pushed the surviving ships north, around Scotland and Ireland, where a great many of them were wrecked on the coasts. It is tempting to make this the founding moment, and the English at the time did exactly that. The commemorative medal read that God blew and they were scattered. But it should be seen for what it was. The Armada was a defensive success. It did not gain England a single acre or a single trade route. Spain rebuilt its fleet within a few years and remained the dominant power in Europe for another 2 generations. The English counter-expedition the following year, sent to burn the surviving Spanish ships, was a costly failure that almost nobody remembers. What 88 actually changed was English opinion. A country that had spent 30 years assuming it might be invaded discovered that it might not be, and a generation of merchants and gentlemen concluded that the Atlantic was a place where an Englishman could take risks. They began taking them almost immediately, and almost all of them failed. Humphrey Gilbert claimed Newfoundland for the crown in 1583 and drowned on the voyage home. His half-brother, Walter Raleigh, sent settlers to an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina twice. The first group gave up and came home with Drake. The second, 115 people, including the first English child born in the Americas, was left there in 1587, while their governor sailed back for supplies. The Armada delayed his return by 3 years. When he finally reached the island, there was nobody on it, and no bodies, and a word carved into a post. There were attempts at a northwest passage that found only ice. There were trading voyages to West Africa that returned less than they cost. There was a colonization scheme in Guyana based on a persistent and entirely false conviction that a city of gold lay somewhere up the Orinoco. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, after 40 years of effort, England held no territory outside the British Isles at all. It is worth stopping on that because the story is usually told as though the empire began here, and in a territorial sense, nothing began here. Every colony failed. Every settlement was abandoned or vanished. The one unambiguous success was a licensed robbery. But something had been built that did not appear on any map. The men who invested in Drake and in Raleigh and in the failed passages north had learned a set of habits. They had learned to pool capital across many investors so that no single one was ruined by a loss, which mattered enormously when most voyages lost money. They had learned to spread a single investment across several ships. They had learned to write the terms down, to divide the return in fixed proportions, and to sue each other in English courts when the division was disputed. And they had learned that the crown could be brought in as a partner, that a monopoly, a charter, or a letter of marque was a thing that could be obtained from the state, and that the state, being poor, would grant it in exchange for a share rather than payment. That last habit is the one that matters. In Spain, overseas expansion was a royal enterprise. The crown licensed, the crown governed, the crown took the silver, and the Council of the Indies in Madrid supervised the whole thing. It produced enormous wealth, and it produced a state so dependent on that wealth that when the silver flow slowed, the state failed with it. England could not do that because England had no crown money to do it with. So expansion was left to whoever could raise the capital privately, and the state's role was reduced to selling permission. That was a weakness. Every serious person at the time understood it as a weakness. A country that cannot fund its own ventures is a country that cannot control them. And it would turn out, over the following 2 centuries, to be the most powerful engine of expansion anyone in Europe had built, because a state can only afford what its treasury holds, and a market can afford whatever it can be persuaded to believe in. Elizabeth died in March of 1603, leaving a kingdom with no empire, a modest fleet, and a merchant community that had spent a generation learning how to sell shares in a risk. 15 months before she died, she had signed a charter for one more of these ventures. It was a company of London merchants, subscribing a modest sum among themselves, asking for a monopoly on trade with the East Indies. Nobody involved expected it to amount to much. The Dutch were already there in force and better funded, and the first English voyages into that trade had gone badly. It would last for 258 years, raise armies of 250,000 men, and conquer India. The charter was granted on the last day of the year 1600 to a body formally titled the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. There were 218 subscribers. They put up something around £68,000 between them, which was a substantial sum for private individuals and a trivial one measured against what they proposed to do. They had no ships suited to the voyage and had to buy them. They had no factories, no agents, and no experience east of the Mediterranean. What they had was a piece of paper granting them, for 15 years, the exclusive right of all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It is worth reading what else that paper permitted, because it is the strangest feature of the entire British Empire, and it is present from the first day. The company was authorized to govern its own employees, to make and enforce law in its settlements, to raise armed men, to build fortifications, to coin money, and, in later charters, made explicit, to wage war and conclude peace with any non-Christian power. A group of London merchants had been granted the powers of a sovereign state to be exercised 9,000 miles away at their own expense. The Crown gave these things away for a reason that will by now be familiar. It had none of the money required to send fleets to Asia and no intention of finding any. Granting sovereign powers to a corporation cost the Treasury nothing and produced customs revenue if it worked. If it failed, the shareholders bore the loss. It very nearly did fail because of the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company was chartered 2 years after the English one, and it was a different order of thing. Where the English company raised £68,000, the Dutch raised roughly 10 times as much and, crucially, raised it as permanent capital rather than voyage by voyage. English subscribers in the early years funded a single expedition and were paid out when it returned. Dutch subscribers bought a share in a continuing enterprise that could plan across decades, build permanent bases, and absorb losses. The Dutch also had a clearer strategy, which was to take physical control of the places where spices grew and hold them by force. In the Banda Islands, the only source of nutmeg in the world, they carried it to its logical conclusion in 1621. The population of roughly 15,000 was killed, deported, or enslaved, and the islands were repopulated with plantation labor under Dutch management. It was the most efficient monopoly in commercial history, and it was built on the near extermination of a people. The English were in no position to compete with that, and in 1623 they were removed from the competition. At Amboina, Dutch authorities arrested 10 Englishmen and a number of Japanese mercenaries on a charge of conspiring to seize the fort, extracted confessions under torture, and executed them. English outrage lasted for decades and changed nothing. The company withdrew from the Spice Islands, so it went to India instead, because India was what was left. This is one of those accidents that determines everything afterwards. The English did not choose India over the spice trade. They were driven out of the spice trade and took the consolation prize. And the consolation prize turned out to be a subcontinent of perhaps 150 million people, producing the finest textiles in the world. The Mughal Empire at this point was among the wealthiest and most powerful states on earth. Its revenues dwarfed those of any European kingdom. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. When the English sent an ambassador, Thomas Roe, to the court of the Emperor Jahangir in 1615, he spent 3 years there and came away with permission to establish a trading post, which he regarded as a considerable success and which the Mughal court regarded as a minor administrative matter concerning some foreigners who wanted to buy cloth. That is the correct proportion for the 17th century, and it should be held on to because the story is usually told backwards from what happened later. For the first 150 years of its existence, the East India Company in India was a supplicant. It rented its ground, it paid customs duties, it petitioned for permits. When it once attempted a small war against Mughal shipping in the 1680s, it was comprehensively beaten, and the company's representatives had to prostrate themselves before the Emperor Aurangzeb and pay an indemnity to be allowed to resume trading. What the company built in those years were not colonies. They were 3 fortified warehouses on the coast, positioned so that ships could load and the garrison could hold out. Madras, on the southeastern coast, from 1639, on land leased from a local ruler. Bombay, a set of malarial islands on the west coast that came to the English crown in 1661 as part of the dowry of a Portuguese princess, and which Charles II rented to the company for £10 a year because he could think of nothing else to do with it. and Calcutta, founded in 1690 on the Hooghly River in marshland, chosen because it was defensible and navigable rather than because anyone wanted to live there. All three would become enormous cities. At the time, they were trading stations with walls, and the trade itself was going extremely well. The company's imports shifted early from spices to Indian textiles, calico, chintz, muslin, and the English market took them in volumes nobody had anticipated. Cotton cloth was cheaper than wool, lighter, washable, and printed in colors English dyers could not match. It became a mania. By the 1680s, the company was importing well over 1 million pieces of cloth a year, and the English wool industry was petitioning Parliament in something close to panic. Parliament responded with the Calico Acts, banning the import of finished Indian cloth. This is worth noting for later. Britain's first response to Indian textile competition was protectionism, because Indian manufacturing was better than its own. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a different empire was being built by different means and to entirely different effect. The Atlantic story begins as badly as the Elizabethan ventures did. Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607, nearly failed repeatedly. Of the first several thousand settlers sent out, the great majority died. Of disease, of starvation, of conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, whose land they were on. In the winter of 1609, there was cannibalism in the fort. What saved Virginia was tobacco, which grew well, sold high, and required a great deal of labor. And what happened next is the part of the empire's history that has to be told without softening, because it is not a dark corner of the story. Measured in money, it was the most valuable thing Britain did in the 17th century. The English settled Barbados in 1627. For the first 15 years, it grew tobacco badly. Then, in the 1640s, Dutch merchants brought sugarcane and the technique for processing it, and the island was transformed within a single generation. Sugar is an unusually demanding crop. It must be cut and crushed within a day or two of harvest, or it spoils, which means a plantation needs a mill on site and a workforce available in a concentrated burst. The work is done in tropical heat with cutting blades and boiling vats. Nobody does it voluntarily for wages that leave a profit. The first solution was indentured English labor. Poor men and women, and a great many transported convicts and prisoners of war, bound for a term of years. It was brutal and it was insufficient because terms expired and survivors demanded land. The second solution was enslaved Africans, bought on the West African coast, transported across the Atlantic and held in slavery for life, with the condition passed to their children. The scale of what followed is difficult to keep in view. British ships would carry somewhere in the region of 3 million people across the Atlantic over the course of the trade, of whom perhaps 400,000 died on the voyage. Barbados went from a few thousand English smallholders to a population that was overwhelmingly enslaved and African within about 40 years. Jamaica, taken from Spain in 1655, went the same way on a larger scale. The mortality was such that the enslaved population did not reproduce itself. It had to be continually replaced by further purchase, which is a fact about conditions rather than about people, and it meant the trade could not stop as long as the plantations ran. And the plantations produced money at a rate that nothing else in the empire came close to. By the end of the 17th century, the small island of Barbados was worth more to English trade than all the mainland North American colonies combined. Jamaica would surpass it. The sugar islands generated the customs revenue, the shipping, the insurance business, the credit networks, and the personal fortunes that flowed back into London and into the ports of Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow. This is why the Caribbean, not America, is the center of the 17th century empire. New England was a collection of religious communities of little commercial interest to anyone in London. Barbados was a machine for turning human beings into capital. There is a temptation in telling this, to reach for the language of atrocity and leave it there. The atrocity is not in question. But the reason it belongs in an account of how Britain acquired a quarter of the world is more specific than moral bookkeeping, and it is this. The Atlantic system is where Britain learned to run an economy on credit at a distance. A sugar plantation was financed in London, insured in London, and supplied on credit from London against a crop that would not exist for a year. The enslaved people who worked it were bought on credit from merchants who were themselves financed in London. Bills of exchange moved between 4 continents to settle debts that no coin ever crossed the ocean to pay. By 1700, England had 2 empires that barely resembled each other. In Asia, a corporation with sovereign powers, renting warehouses from an emperor who could have destroyed it at any moment. In the Atlantic, a set of islands generating the highest returns in the world, worked by people held in bondage, financed by a web of credit centered on a single city. Neither was run by the state. The state's contribution was a set of charters, a navigation law requiring colonial goods to travel in English ships, and a navy too small to protect any of it properly. That last problem was becoming urgent. The commercial empire was now large enough to be worth taking, and England had fought 3 wars with the Dutch in 20 years, without winning any of them decisively. And France under Louis XIV was building the largest army in Europe, and had begun building a fleet to go with it. England had merchants who could raise capital for a voyage. It did not have a state that could raise money for a war. That was about to change. And the change would come not from a conquest or a discovery, but from an accounting arrangement in a building in the City of London. In November of 1688, a Dutch fleet landed an army in Devon, and the King of England fled the country without a battle being fought. What happened next is usually described in constitutional terms. A Catholic king, replaced by his Protestant daughter and her Dutch husband, Parliament's supremacy established, a Bill of Rights. All of that is true, and none of it is the reason this year matters to the story of the empire. It matters because William of Orange did not come to England to be king. He came to acquire England's resources for his war against Louis XIV, which he had been losing. And to fight that war, England had to learn to borrow. The problem was old, and it was structural. Kings borrowed money, and kings defaulted. Charles II had done it in 1672, suspending repayment on crown debts and ruining a number of London bankers. Every lender in Europe understood that a loan to a monarch was a loan to a man who could not be sued, and priced it accordingly. That is why Elizabeth had paid 14% in Antwerp, and why the French monarchy, richer, larger, with more than twice England's population, was permanently short of cash despite taxing its subjects heavily. The change after 1688 was that the debt stopped being the king's. Parliament now controlled taxation, and Parliament guaranteed the loans, and Parliament was composed substantially of the same men who were lending the money. A default would have been the creditors voting to defraud themselves. For the first time in European history, a state's promise to repay was credible, because the people who had to be repaid were the people who set the taxes. In 1694, the arrangement acquired an institution. A group of merchants offered to lend the government £1.25 million at 8%, in exchange for a charter incorporating them as the Bank of England with the right to issue notes. The government took the money and spent it on the Navy. The bank never got it back and was never meant to. The loan became permanent, the interest was paid out of specified taxes, and the debt itself became a tradable asset that could be bought and sold in the city. This is the most important thing in this entire story, and it is almost impossible to make it sound like it. Here is what it meant in practice. A state that can borrow at 3% can spend, in a war, several times what a state borrowing at 8% can spend from the same tax base. Britain's debt would rise from about £1 million in 1690 to over 240 million by 1784. Figures that horrified contemporaries and that a succession of pamphleteers insisted would ruin the country. It did not ruin the country because the interest was serviceable and the lenders kept lending. France, throughout the same period, had a larger economy, a larger population, and a much worse credit position, and had to fund its wars by increasingly desperate expedients, selling offices, selling tax collection rights, and eventually convening the Estates General in 1789 to deal with a fiscal crisis, which is how the French Revolution started. Britain did not outproduce France in the 18th century. It outborrowed it. And what it bought with the borrowed money was the Royal Navy. The scale of that investment is easy to miss, because navies are less visible in history than armies. By the middle of the 18th century, the naval dockyards at Portsmouth, Chatham, and Plymouth were the largest industrial enterprises in the world, employing thousands of men in a continuous cycle of building and repair. A ship of the line cost roughly what a substantial country estate cost, took years to build, and required seasoned oak that had to be bought decades in advance. The Navy consumed a share of government spending that no other European state came close to matching. The result was a strategic position with no precedent. Britain could not put an army into Europe capable of beating France. It never could, and it did not try. What it could do was blockade French ports, take French colonies, capture French merchant shipping, and subsidize other people's armies to do the fighting on land. That last item is the part that connects to everything else. In the wars of the 18th century, Britain routinely paid Austria, Prussia, Hanover, and various German principalities to field armies against France. It was cheaper than raising them. The subsidies were funded by borrowing. The borrowing was serviced by customs revenue, and the customs revenue came from the trade the Navy protected. The whole thing was a closed circuit. Trade paid for the Navy protected the trade and took the enemies, and the credit markets advanced against the future proceeds of both. The 7 Years' War is what that machine looked like at full power. It began in 1756 over a colonial dispute in the Ohio Valley and became the first war fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Contemporaries did not have a word for that. It was, in every meaningful sense, a world war, fought a century and a half before the one that took the name. Britain's strategy was to subsidize Frederick the Great of Prussia to occupy the French army in Germany, and to spend its own resources taking French possessions everywhere else. In a single year, 1759, which the English press called the Year of Victories, the Navy destroyed French fleets at Lagos and Quiberon Bay, an army took Quebec, and the sugar island of Guadeloupe fell. By the peace in 1763, Britain had taken Canada, Florida, several Caribbean islands, Senegal, and the French positions in India. It had also very nearly doubled its national debt. The debate in London afterwards is revealing about what the empire was actually for. There was a serious argument over whether to keep Canada or Guadeloupe, since France was to be allowed one back. Canada was vast, cold, thinly populated, and produced furs. Guadeloupe was a small island that produced sugar and was worth more in annual trade. A substantial body of opinion, including some very sophisticated commercial minds, thought keeping the island and returning the continent was the obvious choice. They kept Canada, partly for security reasons and partly because the West India lobby did not want more competition in sugar. But the fact that it was a genuine argument tells you how the empire was assessed at the time, not by territory, by return. And while all of this was happening, something had changed in India that nobody in London had planned, authorized, or fully understood. The Mughal Empire was coming apart. Aurangzeb, the emperor who had humbled the company in the 1680s, died in 1707 after a reign of decades of expensive warfare in the south. What followed was a rapid decline in central authority. Contested successions, provincial governors becoming independent in all but name, Maratha armies raiding across the subcontinent, and in 1739, a Persian invasion that sacked Delhi, massacred tens of thousands of its inhabitants, and carried off the imperial treasury, including the Peacock Throne. By the 1740s, India was not one empire, but a set of successor states, several of them well-governed and militarily capable, competing with each other and looking for allies. The European trading companies were suddenly useful to them. The companies had disciplined infantry drilled in European fashion, and artillery and, critically, access to credit that could pay troops on time, which most Indian rulers struggled to do. An Indian prince fighting a rival could rent a European contingent. A European company could support a claimant and be rewarded with trading concessions. The French, under Joseph-François Dupleix at Pondicherry, worked this out first and demonstrated in the 1740s that a few thousand well-drilled troops could decide a succession dispute in southern India. The English learned it from him, which brings us to a riverbank in Bengal on the 23rd of June, 1757. Bengal was the richest province of the old empire, enormously productive, densely populated, the source of most of the company's textile exports. Its ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had come to power the previous year at about 23, and had immediately fallen out with the company over its fortification of Calcutta and its abuse of trading privileges. He took Calcutta with little difficulty in June of 1756, and a number of English prisoners died overnight in a cell in the fort. An incident that was enormously amplified in England afterwards, and whose details remain disputed. The company sent Robert Clive from Madras with a force to retake the city. He did, and then he did something considerably more ambitious. Rather than fight the Nawab's army, which outnumbered his own by something like 15-1, Clive negotiated with the men inside it. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was young, recently installed, and disliked by a substantial part of his own court and command. Clive reached an agreement with his commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar, and with the Jagat Seths, the immensely powerful banking family that financed the province's revenues. Mir Jafar would hold his troops out of the battle and would afterwards be installed as Nawab, and the company would be paid. At Plassey, Clive had about 3,000 men, of whom roughly 2,000 were Indian sepoys. The Nawab's army numbered perhaps 50,000. The fighting was brief and largely decided by a rainstorm that soaked the Nawab's powder, while the company kept its own covered, and by the fact that the largest part of the Nawab's army stood and watched. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled and was killed. Mir Jafar became Nawab. The company received an indemnity of staggering size. and Clive personally took something in the region of £250,000, which made him one of the richest men in Britain, and which he later defended before a parliamentary committee by observing that he was astonished at his own moderation. Plassey is often called the battle that won India, and it is a bad description. It was not much of a battle. What it was, precisely, was a corporate takeover executed with military theatre, a bank-financed arrangement with a faction of the existing regime, ratified by a brief exchange of fire. The decisive event came 8 years later, and almost nobody outside specialists can name it. In 1765, after further wars and further installed Nawabs, Clive obtained from the Mughal emperor, by then a figurehead, dependent on whoever controlled him, a grant of the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the right to collect the land revenue, the tax on agriculture that was the basis of all Indian state finance. A London joint stock company, answerable to its shareholders, had acquired the tax revenue of a territory of perhaps 20 million people. The consequences were immediate, and they reshaped everything. Before 1765, the company bought Indian goods with silver shipped from Europe. This had always been the awkward part of the Asian trade. Europe had little that Asia wanted, so trade had to be settled in bullion, and every mercantilist writer in England complained about the drain. After 1765, the company bought Indian goods with Bengali tax revenue. The silver stopped going out. Bengal's own taxes purchased Bengal's own textiles, which were then sold in Europe for profit that stayed in London, and the same revenue paid the company's army, which grew from a few thousand men to over 100,000 within a few decades, composed overwhelmingly of Indian soldiers, commanded by British officers and funded entirely by Indian taxation. That is the mechanism this whole story has been building toward. It is not that Britain conquered India. Britain could never have shipped an army large enough to conquer India, or paid for one out of its own revenues. What happened was that a corporation acquired the tax base of a rich province, used the tax base to hire the province's own soldiers, and then used those soldiers to acquire the next province. From 1765 onward, the conquest of India funded itself. The army that took India was, in the great majority, Indian. This is the single fact that most needs stating plainly, because the phrase British conquest obscures it almost entirely. At the end of the 18th century, the East India Company's forces numbered somewhere in the region of 150,000 men, and something like 9 in 10 of them were Indian soldiers, sepoys from the Persian word for soldier, recruited locally, paid monthly, drilled in European formations, and led by British officers who at no point constituted more than a small fraction of the whole. By the 1820s, the company's army would be among the largest standing forces in the world, larger than the British Army itself. The reason men joined is not mysterious and does not require any theory about collaboration. The company paid, and it paid on time. Indian rulers of this period were frequently in arrears to their troops, sometimes by years, because their revenue systems were disrupted by the same warfare that made the troops necessary. The company, sitting on the land revenue of Bengal and backed by London credit, could guarantee a monthly wage, a pension for long service, and provision for a soldier's family if he was killed. For a young man from a peasant or minor landholding family in the recruiting grounds of the Gangetic Plain, this was the most reliable employment available. That is the machine in its finished form. Bengal's taxes paid Indian soldiers to conquer the rest of India, and each conquest added its revenue to the fund that paid for the next. The wars followed one another for 50 years, with a kind of grinding regularity. 4 against Mysore in the south, where Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan fought the company to a standstill twice before being destroyed at Seringapatam in 1799. 3 against the Maratha Confederacy, the most formidable military power in India, broken between 1803 and 1818. A war against Nepal, the absorption, one after another, of the Indian states that had allied with the company earlier, and now found the alliance had become a form of ownership. The instrument for that last process deserves a name, because it did more work than any battle. The subsidiary alliance was an arrangement under which an Indian ruler accepted a company force stationed in his territory for his protection, paid for its upkeep, surrendered control of his foreign relations, and accepted a British resident at his court. It sounded like a defensive treaty. It functioned as a slow annexation. The cost of the subsidiary force was set high enough that rulers fell into arrears, and arrears were settled by ceding territory, and the ceded territory generated revenue that paid for more troops. Several of the largest acquisitions of the period were made without a war being fought at all, simply by presenting a bill that could not be paid. Now the cost of it, which arrived early and which the company's own directors could not explain away. In 1770, 5 years after the company acquired the tax revenue of Bengal, the province suffered a famine that killed something in the region of 1/3 of its population. The estimates that circulated at the time, and that appear in the company's own records, run to about 10 million people. The failure of the monsoon in 1768 and 1769 was the immediate cause, and Bengal had suffered droughts before. What made this one catastrophic was what had changed in between. The company had taken over the revenue, but not the administration. It collected through the existing Indian officials, without the traditional obligations that had gone with the office, and without any of the customary mechanisms for remission in a bad year. Revenue collection in the famine years was maintained, and in some districts increased, because the company's servants in Calcutta were assessed on what they brought in. Company employees and their agents engaged in private grain dealing, buying up stocks and holding them as prices rose, an activity that was formally discouraged and widely practiced. The traditional systems that had absorbed a bad harvest, the stores, the remissions, the obligations of local landholders, had been disrupted by the transfer of authority, and nothing had replaced them. It should be said clearly that the company did not intend a famine. It intended revenue. The famine is what a revenue-maximizing authority with no responsibility for the population produces when the rain fails. And the distinction between intending the outcome and building the machine that produces it is one the people of Bengal had no reason to care about. The reaction in Britain was substantial, and it was not primarily moral. What alarmed Parliament was that the company was simultaneously presiding over a catastrophe and running out of money. It applied for a government loan in 1772. While its returning employees, the men the press called nabobs, were buying country estates and parliamentary seats with fortunes nobody could account for. The result was the beginning of state supervision. The Regulating Act of 1773, then Pitt's India Act of 1784, created a board of control in London with authority over the company's political decisions. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, was impeached in a trial that ran for 7 years and ended in acquittal, having established very little except that Parliament now considered Indian government its business. The company remained. But from this point, it was a corporation being watched by a state that had begun to suspect it had created something it did not control. While that was happening, Britain lost the most valuable settler territory it possessed. The American Revolution is usually told as a story about liberty, and it was one. It was also, in the terms this story is concerned with, a fiscal dispute. The 7 Years' War had doubled the national debt. The debt was serviced by taxation. Parliament, reasonably enough from its own point of view, took the position that colonies, which had been defended at enormous expense, should contribute to the cost of their defense. The colonies took the position that they had not consented to the taxes. Both positions were coherent. The war that followed was lost for reasons that had little to do with either. Britain lost America because France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic entered the war. And for the only extended period in the 18th century, Britain lost control of the sea. A French fleet held the Chesapeake for a matter of weeks in 1781, which was long enough for the army at Yorktown to be trapped and forced to surrender. The war continued elsewhere for 2 more years, and Britain did rather well in it. The Caribbean was held, Gibraltar survived a 4-year siege, but the American colonies were gone. It was the worst defeat in the empire's history, and here is the strange part. Almost nothing happened. Trade with the newly independent United States recovered within a few years, and then exceeded what it had been under colonial rule. The Americans still wanted British manufactures, still sold their cotton and tobacco into British markets, and no longer had to be defended or administered at British expense. Within a generation, the loss of America looked, in strictly commercial terms, like an improvement. The conclusion drawn in London was one that would shape the next century, that formal possession was not necessary in order to profit from a place, and that governing people was an expense while selling to them was a return. The empire's center of gravity shifted decisively east, toward the trading and revenue empire in Asia, and the settler colonies were regarded thereafter with a certain wariness. Then, in 1793, Britain went to war with revolutionary France, and stayed at war with 2 brief interruptions for 22 years. The pattern was the one established in the previous century, executed at greater scale. Britain funded coalitions, 7 of them paying Austria, Prussia, and Russia to field the armies that fought Napoleon on land. Between subsidies and its own military spending, Britain borrowed on a scale that took the national debt past 200% of national income, a level that would not be seen again until the 20th century. And it used the sea to take everything France and its allies possessed overseas. The Cape of Good Hope, taken from the Dutch, Ceylon, Malta, Trinidad from Spain, Java, briefly, Mauritius, the French and Dutch positions in India, permanently. At Trafalgar in 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleets were destroyed as an offensive force, and after that, there was no navy anywhere in the world capable of contesting British movement across any ocean. Napoleon's response was to try to close Europe to British trade, and Britain's response to that was to sell everywhere else. The continental system pushed British merchants toward South America, toward Asia, toward markets that had previously been marginal, and when the war ended, those markets remained. In 1815, the war ended at Waterloo, and Britain emerged from it with a set of advantages that no country had ever held simultaneously. It had the only navy that mattered, and it would maintain a fleet larger than the next 2 combined for most of the following century. It held naval stations at every strategic choke point from Gibraltar to Singapore. It had the world's only industrializing economy, some decades ahead of any rival. It had a financial system that could raise sums no other state could contemplate. and it had a subcontinent administered by a corporation that paid for its own army. The empire at this point was not the product of a plan. Nobody in 1600 or 1700 had set out to acquire it. It had been assembled piece by piece by chartered companies, planters, and generals acting largely on their own initiative and frequently against instructions from London, funded by private capital and Indian taxes, and ratified afterwards by a government that mostly wanted to know what it would cost. What Britain had built was not an empire in the Roman sense, of provinces governed from a centre. It was a global commercial system with a navy attached and territory acquired where territory happened to be necessary. The men who ran it in 1815 were about to conclude that they no longer needed to acquire much territory at all. In 1807, Parliament abolished the British slave trade. In 1833, it abolished slavery itself across the empire. Both were the product of the most sustained popular political campaign Britain had yet seen. Decades of petitions, boycotts, parliamentary defeats, and the testimony of formerly enslaved men who put the case in print. It was a genuine moral achievement, driven by people who had nothing to gain from it, against interests that had a very great deal to lose. It is also worth stating what the abolition of 1833 actually did. It freed roughly 800,000 people, and it compensated their owners. £20 million was paid out to the planters for the loss of their property, a sum equal to about 40% of annual government expenditure, borrowed on the London market and not fully repaid until the 21st century. The enslaved people received nothing and were bound to their former owners for a further period as unpaid apprentices. Britain paid for abolition by borrowing, which by now should sound familiar, and the people compensated were the ones who had owned human beings. And then abolition became a foreign policy. The Royal Navy established a squadron on the West African coast, whose task was to intercept slave ships of any nation. It operated for around 60 years, and it freed perhaps 150,000 people, and a substantial number of British sailors died of fever doing it. That work was real. It also gave the world's dominant navy a permanent, morally unimpeachable warrant to stop and search the shipping of any country it chose, to negotiate treaties granting it that right, and to intervene on the African coast wherever it found a reason. Britain suppressed the slave trade and acquired, in the process, a license to police the oceans. Both things are true, and holding them together is the only honest way to tell this century. The strategic idea that defined the decades after Waterloo was that formal empire was expensive and usually unnecessary. The reasoning was straightforward and, on its own terms, correct. Britain was the only industrial economy in the world. Its factories could produce cotton cloth, iron and machinery more cheaply than anyone, anywhere. If markets were open, British goods would win them without a single soldier being stationed. Governing a place meant paying for administrators, garrisons, and courts. Selling to it meant collecting profit. The lesson of America had been absorbed. So Britain spent the middle of the 19th century pursuing free trade, repealing its own protective tariffs, including the Corn Laws in 1846, and pressing every other country it could reach to open its ports. The result was what historians later called the informal empire, and it covered far more of the world than the map coloured red. Argentina was never a British colony. Its railways were British built and British owned. Its meat trade ran on British ships to British markets. Its government borrowed in London, and its economy was as thoroughly integrated into the British system as any formal possession. The same pattern held in Brazil, in Chile, in Portugal, in the Ottoman Empire, and in Egypt, where a ruler's modernization program was financed by European loans. on terms that eventually delivered the country's finances into European hands. This is the thing the phrase, "a quarter of the world," understates rather than exaggerates. The territory Britain governed was a quarter. The economy Britain dominated was considerably larger. But an open market is only voluntary if the other party wants it open, and the most valuable market on earth did not. China, in the early 19th century, wanted very little that Britain produced. The trade ran the other way. Britain bought tea in enormous and growing quantities, and paid for it in silver, because Chinese demand for British manufactures was minimal. By the 1820s, tea duties alone accounted for something close to a tenth of total British government revenue, and the silver drain was a permanent grievance. The East India Company found the solution in its own territory. Opium grew well in Bengal and Bihar. The company held a monopoly on its production, licensed private merchants to carry it, and sold it at auction in Calcutta, keeping its own hands formally clean of the delivery. The drug was illegal in China and had been since 1729. It was landed by private traders at the coast, sold to Chinese smugglers, and distributed inland through a network of officials who were paid to permit it. Imports rose from a few thousand chests a year in the early part of the century to something over 40,000 by the late 1830s. The triangle worked like this. British consumers bought Chinese tea. Chinese consumers bought Indian opium. Indian revenue and Indian opium paid for the tea, and the silver stayed home. By the 1830s, opium was among the largest single sources of revenue in British India. In 1839, the Chinese government, having debated legalization and rejected it, appointed a commissioner named Lin Zexu to end the trade. He did what a sovereign government does about a banned import. He blockaded the foreign merchants at Canton, demanded the surrender of their stock, and destroyed it, over 1,000 tons, broken up and flushed into the sea over more than 3 weeks. He also wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, asking directly how a country that prohibited the drug at home could permit its subjects to force it on another people. It was never delivered. The British government's response was to send a fleet. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and it was not a close contest. Steam-powered iron gunboats moved up rivers against wind and current, outranged shore batteries, and destroyed Chinese war junks without effective reply. The war ended when a British force reached the Grand Canal and threatened to sever the artery that fed Beijing. The Treaty of Nanking gave Britain an indemnity, the cession of Hong Kong, and the opening of 5 ports to trade. Later provisions added extraterritoriality. British subjects in China were to be tried under British law, not Chinese, and a most favoured nation clause that automatically extended to Britain any concession China granted to anyone else. A second war, from 1856 to 1860, extracted more ports, an ambassador in Beijing, the legalization of opium, and, at its conclusion, the burning of the Emperor's summer palace over 3 days by British and French troops. This is the plainest thing in the whole story, and it should be said without qualification. Britain fought 2 wars to compel a sovereign state to accept a narcotic it had banned, and the men who prosecuted them understood the case against perfectly well. Gladstone denounced the First War in the Commons as unjust in origin, and calculated to cover the country with permanent disgrace, and voted against it, and it passed anyway by 9 votes. The treaties that followed became the template. Extraterritoriality, fixed tariffs, indemnities, and treaty ports were imposed on Japan, on Siam, and on the Ottoman Empire in various forms. The unequal treaty was a British invention, and it was how the informal empire was enforced when persuasion failed. And in India, the machine that had run since 1765 reached its limit. The company's expansion in the 1840s and 50s had grown steadily less patient. Sindh was annexed in 1843, the Punjab after 2 hard wars with the Sikh Empire, Lower Burma after a war begun over a shipping dispute, and under Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General from 1848, the company adopted the doctrine of lapse. If an Indian ruler died without a natural heir, his state passed to the company, adoption, which Hindu law and custom fully recognized, being disallowed. 7 states were absorbed this way. In 1856, the company annexed Awadh outright, on the grounds of misgovernment, deposing a dynasty that had been a loyal ally for a century. Awadh was also the single largest recruiting ground for the Bengal army. That is the context for what happened in 1857, and the cartridge is only the trigger. The immediate cause was a new rifle whose paper cartridges had to be bitten open, and a rumor never conclusively disproved and plausible given the manufacturing practice of the time, that the grease was a mixture of cow and pig fat, defiling to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike. Behind it sat a decade of grievances, the annexations, the erosion of allowances, the fear that missionary activity and legal reform signaled an intention to convert, the resentment of sepoys required to serve overseas at the cost of caste standing. The revolt began at Meerut in May and spread across the north. Delhi was taken, and the aged Mughal emperor, a pensioner of the company living in his palace, was proclaimed the restored sovereign of India. Cawnpore and Lucknow were besieged. At Cawnpore, a garrison that surrendered under a promise of safe passage was killed, and the surviving women and children were murdered afterwards and their bodies thrown into a well. The revolt failed for reasons that are also part of the story. It did not spread to the Madras and Bombay armies, which stayed loyal. The Sikhs of the recently conquered Punjab fought for the company, as did the Gurkhas. Many Indian princes supported the British or stayed neutral, calculating correctly which way it would end. It was never a united rising, and the company put it down using Indian troops, as it had done everything else. The suppression was ferocious in a way that was deliberate and publicized. Villages were burned along lines of march. Prisoners were hanged in numbers that nobody counted, and in some places executed by being tied across the muzzles of cannon and blown apart, a punishment chosen because it destroyed the body and denied the funeral rites of both religions. Delhi was sacked when it was retaken. The British press, fed on the accounts from Cawnpore, called for exactly this, and got it. When it was over, the company was finished, not because it had lost, but because Parliament concluded that a corporation could not be trusted with a subcontinent. In 1858, the Government of India Act transferred everything: the territory, the treaties, the army, the revenue, to the Crown. The East India Company, chartered by Elizabeth on the last day of the year 1600, was wound up, 258 years after a group of London merchants had subscribed £68,000 for a trading voyage. The British state took ownership of what they had built. It had never planned to acquire India. It had never paid for it. It simply arrived in 1858 to take possession of a fully assembled empire and find the bill already settled by the people who lived there. The empire that Britain assembled in the second half of the 19th century was made possible by 3 technologies, and none of them was a weapon. The first was steam at sea. A sailing ship went where the wind allowed, when the season permitted. The voyage to India took 5 or 6 months and could only be attempted at certain times of year. A steamship went where it was pointed, on a schedule, and by the 1870s, the crossing took under a month. An empire that had been a set of places reachable twice a year became a system that could be administered continuously. The second was the telegraph. In 1866, a cable was successfully laid across the Atlantic, and within a decade, London was connected to India, and shortly after to Australia and the Cape. Before this, an instruction sent to Calcutta and a reply received took the better part of a year, which meant that officials on the spot decided everything, and London learned about it afterwards. That is why the empire had been built largely by men acting on their own initiative. After the cable, London could give an order in the morning and have an answer the same day, and the empire became, for the first time, something that could genuinely be governed from a centre. The third was the Suez Canal, opened in 1869. It cut the distance from London to Bombay by something like 40% by removing the voyage around Africa. It was a French project which Britain had opposed. Within 13 years, Britain occupied Egypt. The way that happened is the informal empire failing and turning into the formal one, and it is the pattern for everything that followed. Egypt's rulers had borrowed enormous sums in Europe to modernize railways, irrigation, the canal itself, on terms that became ruinous as cotton prices fell after the American Civil War. By 1875, the government was insolvent and sold its canal shares to the British government, which bought them with money borrowed overnight from the Rothschilds. By 1876, Egypt had defaulted, and its finances were placed under joint British and French control, with European officials taking a fixed share of revenue for the bondholders. The taxes required to service the debt fell on the Egyptian peasantry. In 1881, an Egyptian army officer named Ahmed Urabi led a nationalist movement against foreign control, and in 1882, after riots in Alexandria, a British fleet bombarded the city and an army landed and defeated him at Tel el-Kebir. Britain announced that the occupation was temporary. It lasted 74 years. The Egyptian episode contains, in miniature, the whole logic of what came next. A loan becomes a claim. A claim requires supervision. Supervision provokes resistance. Resistance requires troops. And troops, once landed, do not leave. Because the thing they were sent to protect has by then become strategically indispensable. And Egypt now held the canal that connected Britain to India. Then, in a period of about 25 years, 7 European countries divided almost the entire continent of Africa between them. The scramble is genuinely strange, and it needs to be said that historians still argue about why it happened when it did. Europe had traded with Africa for centuries, chiefly and appallingly in people, without wanting to govern it. Coastal forts and trading posts had been sufficient. In 1870, perhaps a tenth of the continent was under European control. By 1900, it was over 90%. Several things converged. Quinine made it possible for Europeans to survive in regions where they had previously died in numbers that made occupation impossible. Steamboats made rivers navigable inland. The Maxim gun from the 1880s gave a small force an advantage over a large one that was less a battle than an execution. At Omdurman, in 1898, a British-Egyptian force killed something over 10,000 Sudanese for the loss of about 47 of its own men. But the deeper cause was that Britain was no longer alone. Germany had unified in 1871 and industrialized at speed. The United States was growing faster still. France had recovered. The assumption that had underpinned free trade, that open markets meant British markets because British goods were cheapest, stopped being reliable when other countries could make the same goods and preferred to protect their own producers. So the powers began claiming territory to secure markets before someone else closed them. And once one began, none could afford to stop. In 1884 and 1885, the major powers met in Berlin to agree the rules. There was no African representation of any kind. The conference established the principle of effective occupation, that a claim required an actual administrative presence rather than a line on a chart, which turned the scramble from a paper exercise into a race to plant flags and sign treaties with rulers who frequently did not know what they were signing. The borders drawn in those years were drawn by men who had, in most cases, never been to the places concerned, using maps with large blank spaces on them. They cut through language groups, trade networks, and polities that had existed for centuries, and merged peoples with no history of common government. Most of them are still there. Britain's share ran from Egypt down through Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya, to Rhodesia and the Cape, along with Nigeria, the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone in the west. The ambition, never quite realized, was a continuous strip from Cairo to Cape Town. And in the south, at the very end of the century, the empire fought a war that shook it badly. The South African War began in 1899 against two small Boer republics of Dutch-descended farmers in territory where the world's largest gold deposits had been found 13 years earlier. Britain expected a short campaign. Instead, it took nearly 3 years, required roughly 450,000 imperial troops against perhaps 60,000 Boers, and cost more than £200 million. The Boers, beaten in the field, turned to guerrilla warfare, and Britain answered with a systematic campaign against the population that supported them. Farms burned, livestock destroyed, and civilians, overwhelmingly women and children, both Boer and African, moved into camps. Administration was poor, sanitation worse, and disease did the rest. Something over 26,000 Boer civilians died in the camps, the great majority of them children, and a comparable and less well-recorded number of Africans. The reports that came back, largely through the campaigning of Emily Hobhouse, produced a genuine crisis of conscience in Britain and a broader alarm abroad. The empire had needed almost 500,000 men to defeat 60,000 farmers, and had done it by means that a great many of its own citizens found indefensible. The word that entered political discussion afterwards was overstretch. So here is the accounting, at the point of maximum extent. By 1913, the British Empire covered somewhere around a quarter of the land surface of the earth, and contained something over 400 million people, which was roughly a quarter of humanity. It was the largest empire that had ever existed by a considerable margin. The country governing it had a population of about 46 million and a regular army of about 250,000 men, a substantial part of which was stationed in India. That ratio is the fact this entire story exists to explain. 46 million people did not conquer and hold 400 million. The arithmetic is impossible, and no amount of technological advantage closes a gap of that size. What actually held the empire together was a set of arrangements, and by this point they can be named precisely: local soldiers. The Indian army was recruited, paid, and maintained out of Indian revenue, and it was not used only in India. It fought in China, in Egypt, in Sudan, in Persia, in East Africa. Britain possessed, at no cost to the British taxpayer, a strategic reserve of hundreds of thousands of men that could be deployed anywhere between Suez and Shanghai. In Africa, the same principle produced the West African Frontier Force and the King's African Rifles. Local revenue. Colonies were expected to pay for their own administration and defense, and most did. The empire was, as an accounting matter, close to self-financing, indirect rule. Wherever possible, existing authorities were left in place and governed through. In India, roughly a third of the territory remained under some 600 princely states, whose rulers kept their thrones, their courts, and their internal authority in exchange for accepting British paramountcy. In northern Nigeria, the Sokoto Emirates administered on Britain's behalf. This was not generosity, it was arithmetic. There were never enough British officials to do otherwise. At its height, the Indian civil service, governing 300 million people, numbered around 1,000 men. And the navy, connecting all of it, holding the choke points: Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, Singapore, the Cape, and guaranteeing that goods and troops could move anywhere while an enemy's could not. Meanwhile, the settler colonies had gone in an entirely different direction. Canada was granted responsible government in the 1840s and confederated in 1867. Australia federated in 1901. New Zealand became a dominion in 1907. South Africa in 1910. These places ran their own affairs, set their own tariffs, often against British goods, and were tied to Britain by sentiment, trade, and defence, rather than by authority. The distinction between the colonies that got self-government and those that did not was, with very few exceptions, the presence of a European settler population. It was stated at the time in those terms, without embarrassment, and it is the reason the empire looked from London like a family of nations, and from Lagos or Calcutta like something else entirely. There is one more thing to say about 1913, and it is the thing that makes what follows intelligible. Britain was no longer the world's leading industrial economy. The United States had passed it. Germany had passed it in steel and chemicals and was building a battle fleet. British manufacturing was aging, and its share of world trade had been falling for 30 years. What Britain still had, and what disguised the decline completely, was finance. London was where the world's capital was raised, insured, and settled. British investors held enormous holdings abroad, in American railways, Argentine ranches, Indian bonds, and the income from those holdings covered a trade deficit that had existed for decades. The empire at its zenith was an economy living on the returns of investments made when it was ahead, defended by a navy it was straining to keep ahead of, governed through people whose consent had never been asked, and held together by an assumption that had never yet been tested. The assumption was that everyone involved would continue to accept the arrangement. In August of 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and in the same act declared war on behalf of 400 million people, not one of whom, outside the self-governing dominions, was consulted, and then it asked them to fight. They came in numbers that are difficult to hold in the mind. India sent something over 1 million men overseas. Canada, with a population of about 8 million, sent more than 600,000. Australia sent over 400,000 from fewer than 5 million people, and New Zealand about 100,000 from just over 1 million. The highest proportional commitment of any country in the war. South Africa sent men into Africa and to France. Something around 130,000 Africans served as soldiers in Britain's East and West African forces, and a far larger number, perhaps 1 million, across the campaign in East Africa alone, were conscripted as carriers, of whom an appalling proportion died of disease and exhaustion and were never properly counted. Indian troops were in France by September of 1914, 3 weeks after the war began, and held sections of the line through the first winter in a climate and a kind of warfare nothing had prepared them for. Indian divisions fought in Mesopotamia, in Egypt and Palestine, at Gallipoli, in East Africa. Around 74,000 Indian soldiers died. The empire worked, in other words. Everything built over 3 centuries. The local armies, the local revenues, the shipping, the credit, was thrown into a European war, and it delivered. That is what makes what happened next the ending of this story, rather than an interruption of it. The first thing the war did was reverse the direction of the money. Britain had been the world's creditor for a century. It had financed railways in Argentina, bonds in India, ranches in Australia, and the income from those holdings had covered a trade deficit for decades. In 1914, it was the center of global finance. And being the center of global finance was, as this story has argued from the beginning, the actual foundation of the empire. By 1918, Britain owed the United States something in the region of $4 billion. The mechanism was straightforward. Modern industrial war consumed materials at a rate no combatant could supply domestically. Shells, steel, food, oil, and the only economy capable of supplying them at scale was the American one. Britain bought on credit, and it also borrowed to lend to its own allies, France and Russia and Italy, which meant it took on debt to fund loans that in Russia's case were never going to be repaid by a government that no longer existed. To pay for what credit could not cover, the British government liquidated a substantial portion of the foreign investments that had been accumulated over a century, sold the American securities, in particular, to raise dollars. So the war did 2 things at once. It transferred Britain's position as the world's creditor to the United States, and it consumed the assets whose income had been quietly funding the imperial system. The national debt rose from around £650 million in 1914 to over £7 billion by 1919. The country that emerged in 1918 was a victor with a larger empire and a fraction of its former financial strength. The pound was defended for another decade at enormous cost and eventually abandoned. New York, which had been a provincial market in 1914, became the place where the world raised money. The engine that had built the empire, cheap credit, deep markets, the confidence of lenders, had been spent to win the war. The second thing the war did was harder to measure and worse. Men who fight for a state expect something from it. The Indian political leadership had supported the war effort explicitly on that understanding, that a demonstration of loyalty on this scale would be answered with self-government on the model already granted to Canada and Australia. This was not a fringe demand. It was stated openly and repeatedly by moderate constitutionalists who had spent their careers working within the system. In 1917, the British government appeared to concede it, announcing that its policy was the gradual development of self-governing institutions, with a view to responsible government in India as part of the empire. The reforms that followed in 1919 gave Indians control of some provincial departments while reserving everything that mattered, finance, police, and the army, to British officials. And in the same year, the same government extended its wartime emergency powers into peacetime, permitting detention without trial and trial without jury for political offences. The protests against those powers were substantial. In the Punjab, they were met with a ban on public assembly, and on the 13th of April, 1919, a crowd of several thousand gathered in an enclosed square in Amritsar called the Jallianwala Bagh, some to protest, many for a festival, most apparently unaware of the ban. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with about 50 riflemen, blocked the main entrance with his armoured cars, and ordered his men to fire without warning into the crowd. They fired for around 10 minutes, directing their shots toward the exits where people were pressing to escape, and stopped when the ammunition was nearly gone. The official inquiry put the dead at 379. Indian estimates were considerably higher. Dyer told the inquiry that he had not fired to disperse the crowd, but to produce a moral effect throughout the Punjab, and that he would have used a machine gun if the vehicle carrying it could have entered the square. He was relieved of command and censured. He was also defended in the House of Lords, praised in much of the British press, and presented with a substantial sum raised by public subscription. That last detail did more damage than the shooting. The killing could be attributed to one officer. The subscription said something about the country he served. Amritsar is the moment Indian nationalism stopped being a constitutional movement and became a mass one. Gandhi, who had organized Indian ambulance units in support of the British in 3 previous wars and who had been awarded a medal for it, returned his medal and launched the first campaign of non-cooperation the following year. The demand shifted from self-government within the empire to independence from it. The same pattern appeared across the empire in the same few years, which is why it should be read as a structural event rather than a series of local ones. In Ireland, the oldest colony and the one that had supplied a large share of the empire's soldiers, an independence war began in 1919 and ended in 1921 with a treaty establishing a self-governing Irish Free State. Egypt rose in 1919, and Britain conceded formal independence in 1922 while retaining control of the canal, the army, and foreign policy. Iraq, acquired as a mandate, revolted in 1920 and was suppressed at a cost that led Britain to install a king and govern through him, because direct rule was unaffordable. The dominions went in the same direction by agreement rather than by force. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had signed the Treaty of Versailles in their own right and joined the League of Nations as separate members. In 1922, when Britain came close to war with Turkey at Chanak and asked for Dominion support, Canada replied that its parliament would decide. That answer was the end of a unified imperial foreign policy, and everyone involved understood it. And in the middle of all this, the empire reached its greatest extent. The peace settlements distributed the German colonies and the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire as League of Nations mandates, and Britain took Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, Tanganyika, and portions of Togoland and Cameroon. In 1922, the territory under British administration was larger than it had ever been, around a quarter of the land surface of the earth, and something over 450 million people. 1922 is the peak. It is also the year the Irish Free State came into existence, the year Egypt was declared independent, the year Gandhi was imprisoned for sedition after a mass movement that had shown what non-cooperation could do, and the year Canada declined to follow Britain into a war. The peak and the beginning of the end are the same year, and that is not a coincidence or an irony. They are the same event, because the empire had never been what the map suggested. Return to the arithmetic. 46 million people did not conquer and hold 400 million. That was never what happened, and every part of this story has been an account of what happened instead. An Elizabethan state too poor to build a navy licensed private men to rob the Spanish and took a share, and taught its merchants that overseas violence was an investment. Those merchants pooled their capital into a company, and the crown, still too poor to act, gave the company the powers of a state because a charter cost nothing to issue. A constitutional settlement made the national debt credible, and a country with a smaller economy than France could borrow more cheaply and therefore fight longer, and it bought a navy with the difference. the company acquired the tax revenue of Bengal and used it to hire Bengal's own soldiers, and from that point, the conquest of India paid for itself. When formal rule proved expensive, Britain sold to countries it did not govern and sent gunboats only when a market refused to open. When it did take territory, it governed through the rulers already there, with soldiers recruited locally and revenue raised locally, because there were never enough British officials to do anything else. 1,000 men in the Indian civil service for 300 million people. At no point did Britain pay for its empire out of its own resources. It borrowed, it chartered, it licensed, it taxed the conquered to fund the next conquest, and it hired the people it ruled to hold the people it ruled, which means the whole structure rested on a single assumption, and the assumption was never military. It was that the people doing the fighting and paying the taxes would go on accepting the arrangement. For 3 centuries, enough of them did. For wages, for careers, for protection, for the preservation of a local ruler's position, or because the alternative was worse. That acceptance was the load-bearing element, not the Maxim gun, not the dreadnoughts, not the telegraph. The First World War tested the assumption at maximum load, and the empire passed the test. 1 million Indians served. The dominions gave more per head than Britain did, and the whole apparatus delivered. And then the men who had provided the soldiers and the revenue asked what it had bought them and were told, not yet. The empire lasted another quarter of a century, and much of what came after, the further mandates, the buildings, the ceremonies, the coronation durbars that never happened, belonged to a structure whose foundation had already gone. India became independent in 1947, and after India, the rest followed within a generation, because India had been the thing that made the arithmetic work. It ended, in the end, the way it had begun, not with an invasion or a defeat in the field, but with an accounting, a calculation made by hundreds of millions of people who had been carrying a system they did not own, that the arrangement was no longer worth what it cost them. The empire had always been built on credit. Credit is another word for someone else's trust, and it can be withdrawn,